I'm gonna tell you about 4 books that I think you should consider reading this fall. I'm filming this in between doing laundry and prepping for an exam and doing another async assignment. I'm in 18 units worth of classes, so it's crazy, but I wanted to have this filmed so I could edit this and have it out in time for October, so that's what we're doing. And I've got my stack of books right here. I don't know if you can see them. I can move them over here in case you can. So excuse the crazy hair, the lack of makeup. I'm tired, but I wanted to share these 4 books with you because they're honestly some of my favorite books I have ever read. I like these all for such different reasons. I don't know if I could rank them. I'm going to start with a book that I read last October. I spent the entire month of October reading it, and it just got me into the fall spirit. It was so good. I'd been wanting to read this book for a really long time because I want to read as many classics as possible. I felt like this classic was such a page turner, and let's be honest, although classics are really well written, some of them aren't page turners. This one was, and it's probably one of my favorite classic books now, and I was not expecting to like it that much because I felt that most people I knew really didn't like this book, but I really did. And that book is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I was not expecting to like this book this much. The reason that most people I know dislike it is because all of the characters are extremely morally gray. But I like morally gray characters. I think that they all suck in some way, but I'm intrigued by their story and I want to know more. I just find that reading about flawed characters is so enjoyable because human beings are flawed and they are so flawed. So the book starts from Mr. Lockwood's point of view, but truly Mrs. Dean, I believe, is the main character, even though the book is about the love story between Catherine and Mr. Heathcliff, which they both suck. They both suck. Everyone in this book sucks. But Mrs. Dean was the maid that worked in the house, and she observed them and she watched them grow up and she witnessed all of the things that happened between them. And so she's telling the story to Mr. Lockwood, who he's this new tenant at the house in Wuthering Heights, and he has some questions because he sees this writing on the wall and he thinks he sees like a ghostly woman, and she tells him about how, oh, I think you saw Catherine, and he's like, who's Catherine? And then she tells the story of Catherine and Mr. Heathcliff. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of action for a classic book. This has a lot of action. I mean, it's not like an action book, but if you're looking at it in the sense of here are all of the classic books, I think I've read like 32 classic books or something like that. I actually counted recently when I made my Goodreads account. But this one was probably one of the most action-packed ones, and I think that's why it was such a page turner because so much was happening, and I like that it's kind of creepy and eerie, but it's not overly scary. Like, is there a ghost? It's more about who these people were and what made them into what they were. You know, it's very much a character book talking about how people can suck. I don't know, it's such a twisted romance. They kind of like deserve each other. Okay, they both suck. They should be together because of how horrible they are. Very much sets the tone for Halloween without being gory, without being demonic, without being super, super over the top, but you still get that ghostly element. But you can sleep at night, you know? At least I could. At least I could sleep at night. I mean, the next book on my list is The Haunting of Hill House, and this was the first horror book I have ever read. I read it this year. I actually read it in like March. It might be one of my favorite books I've read this year, which is crazy because I usually am not a horror person. I will watch horror, but I have very selective taste, like nothing gory. I don't like gore. And I don't like anything like demonic and about like possession and stuff. This was more psychological, and I was not expecting that because Stephen King said this was one of his favorite horror stories ever written. And I'm thinking, Stephen King? I could never ever stomach like one of his popular books or movies. I've watched like Mr. Harrigan's Phone, and there was another movie of his that I watched that wasn't considered very scary, and I liked them. But he wrote it, and he said this was one of his biggest inspirations and favorite horror books. So I was scared, guys. I was scared going into this. Some people I know really don't like psychological, but I think it's such a fascinating genre because it makes you scared without actually being anything scary. I don't want to spoil it, But basically it's like, is there anything truly to be afraid of? Or is it hysteria driving these characters to think certain things? There's 4 characters it centers around, and it was psychological because I wasn't sure if they liked each other, if they were becoming friends, or if they hated each other. Like, I couldn't tell the difference because you're only seeing it through Eleanor's point of view, who she's the main character. She's a normal girl, kind of like living with her sister and never really did much with her life, and she wants to be useful. And this doctor, he wants to test out this house to see if it's haunted, do some studies, so he sends out letters to a bunch of random people. Are you interested in staying in this house with me for a week, recording data? Eleanor thinks, this is my chance to be a useful human being and do something with my life because I feel like I'm not doing anything productive and I feel horrible about it. So she goes. No one else replies back to the doctor except one other girl. And then, because the doctor couldn't get anybody else to show up, the owner of the house's nephew comes, and he's in his 20s. He's not like a little boy or anything. They're all in their like 20s, 30s, except for the doctor, who's like a little bit older. So the 4 of them stay there with the maid, but the maid, she will not stay at night. She leaves every night to go back to her house. And so things ensue. And it's very interesting because you're trying to figure out, is what's happening supernatural, or is it a human thing that's causing this? And I'm not going to say much else because I don't want to spoil it, but I was very satisfied, and the ending had me Googling and trying to figure out, like, oh my gosh, is this? And like, did this mean that? And I personally love books that make me do that. I think the only book I've read this year that made me Google the ending was Picnic at Hanging Rock, which I almost put on this list, but it takes place during Valentine's Day and spring break. This one's scarier than Wuthering Heights, but I don't think it'll make you be terrified. Maybe I'm wrong, because it is a little bit creepy. There is like actual somewhat horror stuff that happens, but it depends on how you read it. This next book on my list is probably the least scary book of all of them. I felt it should still be on the list for those of you that want a fall book that doesn't terrify you, but still creeps you out a little and also moves you and shows you some of the hope in the world, if that makes sense. I feel like this book is more food for the soul in a good way, but it also gives you a scare, but not nearly as scary as the other ones, but it is creepy. And that is Jane Eyre, which I read this before Wuthering Heights. It was the first Bronte Sisters book that I read, and it did take a while to get through because look how thick that is. I cried a lot during this book because I really admired Jane Eyre as a protagonist. I think she truly believed in doing the best that she could and being like a good person, and so many people around her didn't want her to succeed, and she just had this hope to persevere that really moved me, even when like the world fell down around her, like at least 4 different times during this book. Her world fell apart, and she pulled herself off the ground and kept moving, and she was like, I have faith in God that I can persevere and I can keep going. It follows her journey as a little girl. Her parents are dead. She's left with this aunt who is just super, super mean to her, super mean. Her cousin is abusive, super mean. Lock her in her room, and it starts where she thinks she sees a ghost of her uncle who made the aunt promise to treat her like one of her own because she was, I believe, his sister's daughter. Might have been his brother's daughter, but I think it was his sister's daughter. And of course the aunt doesn't listen, and so she thinks she sees his ghost, and she gets scared and tries to tell her aunt, but her aunt's like, you wicked child, like blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And then she gets sent off to a boarding school. And that's like the first chapter, so it's not really like a spoiler, but then you follow her as she goes to this boarding school, and then you see her first job, and then you see her fall in love. She did so much stuff, like she went through so much, and she was so kind to other people, and so many people used her, and she never gave up, and in the end, it's a good ending. The only thing that I had a problem with this book was the age difference of the love interest. If you pretend that he's younger, it's a little bit more manageable. He does have a very interesting plot though. There is murder, there is blood, there is fire, there is ghosts. It's creepy, but I feel like since it's so dense, it comes in waves. And so some chapters are like, this is creepy, what's going on? And then there's other chapters where you're like, oh, coming of age, childhood friendship, figuring out the meaning of life, and then just wanting to cry. So I feel like it's a very balanced book. I'd say it's an October-November book where you get the creepiness of October, but you get the wholesomeness of November, if that makes sense. This next book was my favorite book 4 years before I read Pride and Prejudice. This was my favorite book. And I'm going to read it again this October, but a different version of it. You might already know what it is. It's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I love this book. I was actually rambling about it to one of my friends today. We got coffee this morning and she was talking about how her brother's obsessed with this book, and I was like, yeah, he's so based because this book is amazing. It's not just like, oh, the monster's scary. There's so much like depth there and metaphor, and he's a victim. I had to read this in AP Lit when I was in high school, and I thought, great, I have to read this for AP Lit. How fun is that? And then I really liked it, and then I had to read it again for another literature class, and I found I enjoyed it more the second time. Then I got all obsessed with looking up lore about Mary Shelley and her life. You've probably heard the story, but in case you haven't, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and one other guy, I want to say it was Keats, but I might be wrong, but he wrote the book Vampire. They were all at Byron's mansion during a thunderstorm, and they're like, hey, let's have a contest. Who can write the scariest story? Let's see who wins. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. I think she wrote it when she was 19. She was a teenage girl, and she single-handedly created the genre of science fiction with this book. Yes, most people say this book started the genre of science fiction. A teenage girl single-handedly started the genre of science fiction. She wrote it because she was struggling with the grief of how she was married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, who he was not the greatest guy. He was years older than her. They had a baby. The baby died. She was grief-stricken. She felt alone in the world, like a monster in the world. Thus, Frankenstein's monster was inspired by her grief, her amalgamation of this despair and feeling like she doesn't belong, and she created this incredible story about a scientist who studies necromancy and wants to bring life into the world, but ends up creating a vile creature, but this creature just wants to be loved by the scientist, but the scientist does not love his creation. And because of that, the monster does horrible things trying to seek Victor Frankenstein out. But Victor Frankenstein is like, no. The monster's like, well, since I have to be alone in this world, so do you. And it's so crazy. The book is nothing like any movie I've seen. Nothing like the adaptations. It's just so deep. It's labeled as horror, but it's truly science fiction. Yeah, it's scary at times, but I did not think this was that scary. I love this book so much, guys. I really love this book. If you haven't read it and you want to be spooked out, but you don't want to have nightmares, and you also want to be moved and you want to be impressed by a young female writer who single-handedly created the genre of science fiction, read this book. It's not that long. It's really good. I think it's a staple classic book that you should read. So these are my fall recommendations for October, maybe November. More so October, but like I said, Jane Eyre could be a November book. I highly recommend all of these. Are they all technically classics? Yes. Thank you for watching this video. I have a lot of homework that I have to get to and exams to prep for. It's a lot. I had to take my car to get repaired at the auto shop. I'm just so drained. So thank you for watching this. I love making these videos so much, and if you would like me to make videos about any other kind of writing or reading, let me know. I'd love to talk more about books with you, or honestly anything in the creative writing arena. I'm hyperfixated on literature, okay? I'm just gonna say it like that. I got this grandpa sweater at a thrift store. Pretty cool, right?